please consider sponsoring me on Patreon. The link is in the description. You'll be helping me to build open source innovation automation solutions and also develop a low-cost 3D metal printing project as documented on my other YouTube channel, Calabao CNC. Thank you. Hey guys, so today we're going to go a little bit into like some of the folder structures, particularly the framework. So there's some pieces that I'm going to put in place here. Again, I should mention, there are some things about the framework that you might not like, and this is probably going to be one of them. So I'm going to copy over some files that I built for the Node.js app, and let's see if we can do that here. They are essentially constants files. So we're just under the framework folder. I'm going to make a new folder called constants. And we're going to see that this actually has, we're going to go into this a little bit. So there's a lot of stuff here. And probably not all of them are going to be needed, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to include them, and then you can remove whichever ones you want if you pull this repo and use it. So we're just going to go into that a little bit here. And this is one of those, these are a lot of the requirements. You'll see as we get into it, you'll see why these things are so important. So first of all, we've got the basic constants, and the basic constants are essentially just single characters or two-letter combinations, two-character combinations, uppercase, lowercase, mixed case, where the first letter's upper, second letter's upper, those kinds of things. So you can see we've got single quotes, special characters, percents, at, hash, dollar, and then the alphabets, lowercase, uppercase, and then alphabetic codes, two-letter combinations. So we've got every combination here, and then ultimately these constants are then going to be used by the basic constants and the phonics constants to build up reusable partial phrases. And ultimately we come down to word constants and system constants, where those are, and it's not universal. We don't use that 100%, but we try to, because there's a lot of constants here. So we just created a lot of these and date timestamps, and it's basically just pulling individual words and using them, and some of them are being reused. Now the main purpose for this is to not have to have any hard-coded strings in the code. And some people may look at this and say, well, this is kind of crazy. And you might be right, it kind of is. But we've also built in the Node.js repo, we've built a system to unit test these constants. So there's a system to unit test them. And if a unit test fails, maybe you haven't written a unit test. If you create a new constant, a new string constant, or something to that effect, and there is no validation or unit test for that constant which you have created, then it will actually generate a unit test line of code for you as to what you should insert. So we're going to actually put some of that together, sort of bring some of those ideas from the Node.js app, and we'll put them in here. But these are sort of universal, and there's a whole lot of them. I mean, I've got shape constants and color constants and isotope constants and elements. Elements from the periodic table of the elements. There's color constants, various colors, and like I said, we're not using every single letter combination, but there are, for the most part, we try to as much as possible. This possibly could be refactored to do that a little bit more, but it's a kind of a work in progress. So it's gotten pretty far along and it works pretty well, so we're going to bring those in and we'll use those. I think another major thing I'm going to do, instead of implementing the runner directly, and before I really get into the runner, I actually want to build the build system. So I'm going to create a new folder here, and we'll call it Cafe Royale Builder. And that will be the system we use to actually compile the ES6 code into Java Core or Java Common, JavaScript Common. And so we're going to work on that. So here we're going to have, let's see here, I'll make a new file, call it build.js, and that'll be our build file. And first things first in here is, well, normally we would bring in the primary framework controller, but not going to do that just yet. Let's bring in some constants. We're going to have like a build constant. So import star as C from constants. Now, I haven't created this yet, so and this will be build dot constants. Okay, sorry about that. And actually, before we even do this, we should have some other stuff here at the top. I want a user bin environment node, so we're going to use that. And another important thing is to make sure we implement Docker. There's some standards we're going to use here. So file is build.js, and the at module tag is just going to be the build module, and the description, this is the main init for the build process for the application. Okay. This includes the build, which uses Babel to transpile the code down from, oops, okay, ES6 ECMA script 6 syntax to JavaScript common syntax. Okay, perfect. And all non-code files are also going to be not transpiled, of course, but they'll be transferred, including generated documentation, which will be generated actually of this header that I'm typing out right now, are copied to the bin folder. Yes, that's what we want, under the same nested folder structure. Yes. It also includes the release process, where the compiled code and non-code files, configuration and documentation, is packaged, or I should say are packaged up into a single zip file and saved in the release folder. All right, and some of the dependencies. Let's see here. We're going to have at requires module build constants. Okay. And then we're going to need some of these constants that I just imported. So we're going to have at requires module system constants, at requires module generic constants, and at requires module basic constants. Like I said, the system constants will inherit some from the generic constants, some from the phonics constants, and the generic constants and the phonics constants ultimately inherit from the basic constants. So they kind of trickle up in a sort of, and it's when I say the word inheritance, I'm not really meaning like object class and inheritance. It's really just a compositional inheritance. Essentially, they reference the other one. It's a referencing inheritance. Okay, so a couple of the things we're going to need for sure at require path. I'm sorry, this should not be a require. Oh yes, this is documentation, so yes it does. At requires, this should be, this of course is going to be a remote reference. So at link, oops, sorry, we don't do that. HTTPS : npm is.com package path pipe path. And okay. Sorry, that should be npm JS. I don't know why I'm typing incorrectly here. Okay. And then, of course, we're going to need a data management system at requires module data. I haven't written that one either. You haven't seen that yet. And then, of course, author and date 20, 10, and today's date is 12. And at copyright, okay. All right. 2020. I said what the link said. All right. Reserved. Okay, perfect. All right. So now that we've got this build constants, I need to make sure I get this data module defined, and that'll probably be the first thing. And it should be a fairly simple singleton model that we're going to follow. All right, so under the framework, I'm going to create a new folder, and let's call this, we're starting to flesh out the folder structure a little bit. We're going to call this resources, and inside resources, we're going to put a data.js file. Data.js. Okay. And inside here, of course, we've got to do our basic header. Okay, at file data.js, at module data, at description, contains the singleton data structure definition that allows the entire application to share data between various components of the framework and greater application. There were many attempts to implement a proper singleton pattern, but, well, I'm just going to leave this off because I had done this. Okay. This is pretty generic. We don't really have any dependencies here. We just export var data equals and an empty data object. Pretty simple there. There would be a possibility of implementing additional fully qualified singleton patterns, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. All we really need is just this, and it seems to work pretty good. All right, so let's come back. Now we've managed to build that dependency. This path dependency, that'll come in just fine. Don't really need to worry too much about that, but let's bring in our other constants. So we need to import star as s from, I need to go up a folder, and then we go, let's see here, down, oops, we need to go up another folder. Okay. Then we go down to framework, constants, and system.constants. Import star as G for generic. Same framework, constants, and generic dot constants. Okay, and then import star as B for basic, framework constants, basic dot constants. Okay, and of course we need our path equals require path. This should be an R. There we go. And then of course we're going to use our data structure D equals require. I don't know what's wrong with me today. Okay. Framework resources data. Okay. Now we're going to set up the app root. Global.app root equals path.resolve dir name. That gets us that, and our root path equals okay. Our copy result. This is what we're going to use to store the result of the copy process to indicate if it's true or false, if we've had successful copy or failure in the copy process. And then we need to get this baseline. So there's a very unique reporting system that we're going to build into this, and base file name is path.base name, module.file name, path extension name, and module file name. Okay, so you'll see what we do with these. Part of it is this the app root path that's going to lead to helping us set up some configuration stuff, and this root path sort of is ultimately going to store that locally when we're actually in a function, and this base file name is going to be used as we're like doing console logging and reporting and various other tracking systems within or debugging. Also, it gives an additional capability for debugging. Okay, so very first thing, there's a couple functions we're going to need now. Well, actually, you know what? I should actually, well, there's 3 functions we're going to need before we actually build out the whole application. So I'm just going to write the stubs, and then we're going to fill them out as needed. So we're going to have function bootstrap application deployment, and that'll actually be reused for the release cycle and build cycle. So we're going to use both of those, and then there's going to be a function deploy application. Okay. And there'll be a last one is function release application. Okay. Now we need to implement headers for these. Let's start with this one right here. Okay. At function release application. At description determines if the current version number is higher than the release archive of zip files. So that's going to be an interesting one. The return type is, let's get rid of that because that gets messed up. We're just going to, it's a void return type. And there's nothing to put a description there. Author and a date 2010-12. Okay. Alrighty. And we need something for the deploy application. Put the header there. At function deploy application description. This is the main function to deploy application. The function copies all non-code files from the source application my app name, whatever your app name is. In this case, it'll be Cafe Royale. Resources folder to the bin application my app name. Insert your app name there. Resources folder. Okay, that should be pretty simple. Finally, all the transpiled code and non-code files are packaged together into a zip file, okay, with the date, time, stamp, and version number, which is why it's important to do this, because early on in the development cycle, this forms either a patch or a release. Okay, we got the return. I think the return is also void here. So we wipe this out. Void. Get rid of that. Author. Sign our code and put a date. 2020, 10, 12. Okay. And then we got a Bootstrap application here. That function header should look like this. Function Bootstrap application deployment. Description. Set up all the application data and configuration settings. That's why we need this. Okay. Return type again. Void. And wipe that out. And again, sign our code. Okay. Alrighty. So now that we got that stuff in place, all right, let's see what's next. All right, so next we actually need to call these as part of implementing this. So Bootstrap application deployment is the first function we call, followed by deploy application, followed by release application. So we're just going to call all three of those functions in sequence, and that will bootstrap our this code basically, and then the deploy application will do what this description says, of course, and the release application will finally release the archive zip file. So essentially we've written our three functions, and then we're going to call three of them in sequence. So let's save that, and let's go ahead and get started with the very first one, which is going to be our Bootstrap application. And this is where we're going to start to take our deep dive into building our framework. So it's pretty cool. All right, very first thing we're going to need is the root path. Path.resolve, of course. Dir name. Yep. And then we need to send this to the framework, basically. Root path. It's probably going to go through and clean it up and remove anything. King, because of course this is Royale, Cafe Royale, so king.process root path. Root path. We're going to be following similar things to like kings, bishops, knights, that kind of terminology for some of these things. So the king is going to be like the king of the controllers, and then we're going to have sort of like I don't know what you would call it, maybe governors or something like that under the king, or bishops or and then knights, and so there'll be a hierarchy in much the same way you would have inside like a monarchy. So that's kind of the theme we're going to be going with here. Some other names we could use, of course, you know, we could call it, instead of king, we could call it emperor, or, and then the other ones we could call duke or duchess or baron or baroness. There's all kinds of different names you could go with, but we'll just stick with the king for now. So, or you could do queen if you wanted to be a female gender type. naming structure, that would be fine too. Whatever you want here. This is a little bit more flexible to whatever kind of framework you're implementing or the purpose, whatever it is that you want to do. So we've got that in place. Let's go and create the actual, well, so we've got our constants and our resources, but we need a place for these to land. And we're going to, the place where all of these things are going to land are going to be, I'm going to make a folder called controllers. And we've got the king controller and the baron controllers. So let's make a new file here called king.js. And let's start with the header. And at file king.js at module king and description contains all the functions to manage the entire application framework at the highest level. Also provides an interface to easily manage all of the application features and various functionality from a single point of entry. Okay. All right, now there's some dependencies we're going to have here. So we know what we're going to need. Let's just start with the basics. Well, actually there's one major piece we're going to need to implement very first and foremost, and that is requires module loggers. We absolutely must have the logging system in place, and then the others are going to be the ones we've already seen. The basic constants requires module generic constants and actual system constants. Okay. And of course the usual one, this one is going to be pretty much carried along with all of the constants ones, is the, now I've already got it. Let's just go copy paste it from over here. This one right here, the path. We are absolutely going to need that. Okay. And another one that's going to be everywhere requires module data. Always we're going to have that data pretty much everywhere. And sign our code again. Okay, at date. Yeah, it is 2020. 10, 12. Okay. And this is code again, so let's copy from over here. So, file header. Okay. All right, so what are we gonna, let's just go ahead and set up the imports here. Import loggers from, and we haven't created this yet, but we're gonna have to do it. And this will be the executioner, essentially the one that is responsible for executing. In this case, it'll be executing code and not doing killing activities. We don't want to think of it that way, but it is kingship and bishops and stuff, and so executioner, we'll go with that. That's going to be the logger system, and then of course we need star as b from constants, basic constants. Import star as g from constants, generic dot constants. Okay. As s for system Okay, and the path. We're going to need the path. Okay, D, var D equals require resources data. Okay, now this is where we're going to be doing that file name, the base file name again. We're going to need that, so let's just copy paste this. This will be exactly the same. And the very first thing here we're going to do is the process root path. So, because that's what we just called from right here. So process root path, that's the first function we need to implement. Function process root path. System root path. Okay. And we need a header for that. At function process root path and a description. Processes the root path of the application using business rules. Okay. We're going to put some notes in here by calling path.resolve dir name. This does not return the true root path of the application. That's correct. That's because of our folder structure. It returns the path to the currently executing file, which is yes, or the file that was executed first. Which is C:, app, insert your name here, app name, application, oops, application, and then app name again here. That would be the path that it's going to be returning. But what we really need for the root path is just C:, app name. That's the path we need. So that's what this function is essentially doing. Now we got a param here, type string, and that is the system root path. Yes, the root path as returned by calling path.resolve dir name and return string. We're going to return that string cleaned up. The true root path of the application. Okay, and we sign our code again. Date 10/12, and I'm going to add some additional notes here. Oh, sorry, no, I'm not. This will be fine. Okay, so let rules equal, rules, I guess it's 0, equals s.c parse system root path. Now, you're wondering, why am I creating a rules object here? This is kind of weird. Oh, and here we go. So this is the first use of that system constant, and I've prefaced it with the letter C. which indicates that it is a constant. And for the most part, just about every constant is going to be essentially what is after the C in quotes. So it would essentially work out to be like this. But of course, that's not entirely true for this case. Oh, actually, yes, it is. Yes, it is parse system root path. It would be essentially that. Because this is a rule that we're going to execute. It's actually a business rule. A business rule is technically a function. You'll see how we implement it here in a second. So that's the name of the rule that we want to execute. And then a rule broker dot bootstrap business rules. And the reason why we need to bootstrap the business rules is because we're actually going to have client business rules in addition to system business rules. So we want to be able to have both of those and actually combine them into one singular business rules system. That way you can define your own business rules in addition to the system business rules that will be defined as part of the framework. So we bootstrap those business rules, and then actually we want to, and there's some additional stuff we're going to need to do here because there's commands. So when we actually get past this, it's not just all business rules, there's also commands. And so we're going to call baron commander dot bootstrap commands, because we're going to have commands as well in addition to business rules. And client commands will be commands that you want to define, your own custom commands, in addition to the commands that will be defined within the framework. Same as the business rules. So let root path equals rule broker dot process rules system root path rules. Okay. So that'll be that, and then we basically return root path. That's it. Now we got to go implement these. So, but before we do any more implementation, we absolutely need to set up our export. Now I like to do exports differently. You could put an export right in front of this function if you wanted to. I like to do it down here because I like to keep them all in one place. That way, I mean, I kind of grew up in like, I didn't say grow up. I did do a lot of VB programming, and when you're writing VB programming in traditional VB language, you could potentially have memory leaks, and because of that, what I tried to do was always declare the objects at the beginning and at the beginning of a function, and then always set everything to empty or nothing or null at the end of the function. That way you could look at the beginning of the function and say, oh, these are the objects I created, and at the end of the function scroll down and say, oh, these are the objects I've cleared. So you can easily map between and make sure that there's no memory leaks or potential for heap corruption. Obviously it's not really much of a problem with JavaScript, but I still like to follow, I mean, it's a good sort of business practice, coding practice. So I like to put everything in one place and do it this way. So we'll do export default and process root path. And I'm going to go ahead and implement one more, which is a wrapper for the console log. So we're going to get into that as well. And those will be our export defaults. So the console log be another function, console log, and it's going to take a class path and a message. So that's going to be how we sort of format our logs as we're logging them. And I need to implement the header for this, of course. So at function console log and description. Description is this is just a wrapper for the loggers.console log function. Okay. And the parameters, okay, we're going to take a string for the class path. This will be a string. And the class path description is the class path for the caller of this function. Function file.function or class.method. Perfect. Okay. And this also type is going to be a string, but it could also be a Boolean. It could also be an integer or an object. Probably could go on and on here, make a map or other stuff, but let's just call it like that. Message, the message or data content that should be dumped to the output. Okay. Return type, as you guessed it, is void. We might change that later, but I think for right now that's good. Again, sign it. And a date. 12. And a note. Are we gonna have a note on here? Yeah, I'm not gonna worry about the note. Okay. Console log. Loggers.console log class path. Like I said, this is just a wrapper, so there we go. And do I have it there? Okay, perfect. All right. So a couple different things we're going to need to do now is let's see here. This is process root path. We need to start building our rule broker. So give me a second here. All right, so in addition to the controllers, we need to have a new folder called business rules. And this is going to be very critical to the entire framework. All of these folders are. They're all very important. But then underneath here, we're going to have another file called the rule broker.js. Okay, and this will sort of manage all of our business rules. Or be a broker for business rules, I should say. All right, so let's make sure we fill this out. At file, rulebroker.js, at module, rule broker, and a description. Okay, the description contains all the functions necessary to manage the business rules systems. Okay. And then some requires. So we're going to require we're going to organize the rules in a rules library. So we're going to have requires module rules library and requires module basic constants. Okay. Requires module system constants. Okay. And of course the usual requires at link https mjs.com/package/path. Okay, and at requires module and the all important data, and then of course we sign it. Date, the infamous 2020, and then we're going to have copyright. So we'll just copy that. All right. So import star as rules from first and foremost is the rules library. Yes, we're going to import that, which we haven't made it yet, but we're going to make it here in a second. Import star as b from some basic constants. Basic.constants. Import star as s from constants system.constants. Okay, and of course the usual var path equals require path, and var d equals require resources data. All right, and the very first thing we do here is function to bootstrap business rules. And actually, that one is going to call the rules .init rules library. And that's basically just going to forward that function on there. And we'll put our labels here. It's exposed at this level. Bootstrap business rules. Okay. And the description is captures all of the business rules string to function call map data in the rules library. Okay. And migrates that data to the D data structure. Yes. Continuing on with that note, let's see here. All right. So this is a little bit of a longer note. This is important now because we are going to allow the client to define their own business rules separate from the system defined business rules. So as your developers come in, and this is kind of coming back to that emergent behavior that I talked about, allowing your customers or the application to define separate business rules from the framework defined rules allows your developers, or kind of encourages your developers to have more mature behavior and follow this process. So that way we don't encourage these bad emergent behaviors that would eventually cause technical debt to increase. So we need a way to merge all client defined and system defined business rules into one location. Then the rule broker will execute business rules from the D data structure and not the rules library per se. Okay, so basically these are just containers for rules, and then ultimately all of this stuff's going to be put onto the D data structure. This will allow the system to expand much more dynamically and even be user defined and flexible to client needs. Okay, now how do we do that? First of all, this return type is going to be void, and we sign it, and give it date. Okay. And some other functions we're going to need are function add client rules, and this is the client rules. Okay. We got another function header here. Add function, add client rules, and a description. Merges client defined business rules with the system defined business rules. Okay. And the parameter here is going to be an array of objects. Okay, client rules that should be merged with the system rules. All right, and then we have a return. That is void, and we sign it. Okay, and the implementation here is pretty darn simple. It's just object.assign, and we're going to assign D s.c business rules and client rules. So we're just going to merge those two together, and that's it. That's all it is. All right, so the next one is going to be basically the only thing that we export. I'm sorry, no, we do have, we are exporting a bunch of stuff here. Okay, let's see here. We do, but I'm going to explicitly export. This is the only one that I explicitly export. Const process rules. Function input data, input metadata. Part of this is to be, being able to be adaptable for future use. I shouldn't technically need to include the metadata there, but I do it. Some of the rules implement that way. Rules to execute. This should be a lowercase r. We don't want linter to complain. Not that I have linter plugged in right now, but we don't want to. Okay. And a header again. Add function. Process rules. And a description. Parse the given input object string, integer, data, or function through a set of business rules, because we could execute a bunch of rules. Some rules do not support chaining. Where the rules are defined in the input rules map. Okay, and the parameters are, let's clean this up. Okay, data type is string, integer, object, or function. And some very interesting function uses there. This one, input metadata, should be string, integer, boolean, or a map. Rules to execute, this comes back as basically just a map or an array, technically. I'll just put it array because that's what it is. Okay, and the return type, Could be a string, integer, object, or a function. Okay, so let's document this. It returns a modified data object, string, integer, boolean, or function where the data has been modified based on the input data. Input metadata and business rules that were executed. Okay, and I need to put up some descriptions here. The rules to execute are the name or names of the rule or rules that should be executed for modding the input data. Okay. Input metadata is defined as additional metadata that should be used when processing the business rule. And the input data is defined as the primary input data that should be processed by the business rule. All right, and then we sign it. Add date. Okay, and then we just have a few lines of code here. We're going to say let return data equals input data. And we're going to say for let rule in rules to execute. If the rules to execute dot has own property, that's the rule. So if that's true, then we say let key equal rule and let value equal rules to execute key. All right. Return data then equals d s.c business rules and the value, and we pass in the return data and the input metadata. Okay, then we come back out of there and we return the return data. Perfect. Okay. So finally, I'm going to draw up an explicit export block. And it's just bootstrap business rules, add client rules, and oops, and process rules. Okay, so I know it's explicit, it's already done, but that's fine, it shouldn't cause any harm. All right, so the next major piece that we need to implement is, of course, the rules library. So there's a whole bunch of business rules here. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and implement the new file. Just call it rules. If I could spell right, rules library.js. Okay. And again, we got to start with our header, file header. So add file, rules library.js. Module is rules library. Description. It contains all of the system defined business rules as an array between function names and function calls. So essentially it's an array of function calls. Here's the rules we're going to use. Requires module character generation at requires module string generation at requires module math well, we'll leave the math operations off for now. System constants and at requires module data and sign it. Date is and let's see, do I still have the copyright there? That's good. All right. And then we start importing star as character generation from, we haven't written any of these yet, but rules character generation. Import star as string generation from rules string generation. Import star as string, oh, I didn't actually include this one, string generation, and we need one more at requires module string parsing. Okay, so we'll get that one down here as well. String parsing from rules string parsing. Okay. And then the constants, import star as s from constants system.constants. And then of course d equals require resources data. All right. This is just going to be a single blob of data here. So export const init rules library equals function and this has its own header at function init rules library and description initializes, I can never spell this correctly, I always screw it up, business rules function data structure on D. Okay, return type is void and author $10.12. Okay. Now D s.c business rules equals an empty object, and then the same thing again, s.c business rules equals okay, and let's see. Okay. All right, so I think we're getting close here to calling it a day. Let me see if I can just open up a few of these other files. We're going to go ahead and create the character generation, the string generation, and the string parsing in the rules folder. So I'm going to make a new folder here called rules. Rules, okay, and we're going to add 3 new files. These are going to be the files that we're going to implement. New file, This one will be character generation.js. Okay, and new file, string generation.js, and string parsing, new file, string parsing.js. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and pull some of these together, and ultimately I'm going to implement these in another episode. So we'll have dedicated episodes to each one of these because they're quite sophisticated. So I forgot one thing. I need to go ahead and push these changes. Let's see, E drive. Okay, E drive. Git add. Git status. Git commit -m. Let's say framework build out part 1. Git status, git push, and there we go. Okay. If you find this video helpful, please click the like button below and click the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when new videos are published. This also helps me out and lets YouTube know that you enjoy my videos. Thank you very much.